Soviet Union on the United States.
But since the advent of nuclear weapons, the United States does not start fighting.
Alex, who you take me for? Some kind of pervert? Yes, I looked her up once.
Gentlemen, this is why the CIA is no place for a woman. We're going backwards in time.
The staging of memory on film is a strange process because unlike photos or a textbook, films as a medium is multisensory, therefore it engages with the past far more vividly and experientially than anything else before. It's a temporal entry point in a way because the past is reconstructed in the present before your very eyes, but this is weird because it's remembering a past that is constructed and mediated on cinematic needs rather than historical engagement. Even though films by nature ironically do become historical documents, the point is, Dark Phoenix is a dumb movie, but a characteristic that stuck out to me was the lack of fashionable historical markers that had become a fun visual character in each X-Men movie, starting with First Class. Well, I guess technically X-Men Origins Wolverine, but for the purpose of maintaining a sense of continuity, let's just refer to the beginning series of the X-Men films as the main unit of exploration.
Alright, you've piqued my interest. What do you want?
X-Men First Class was set in 1962, specifically around the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this event is a central component to the narrative. Shaw's entire plan is built on manipulating the tensions between America and the Soviet Union, and therefore it contributes to the thematic ambitions, the story about Eric and Charles' ideological incompatibility. It's still an incredibly simplified vision of history because it's not about exploring a historical situation based on historical documents, but it does to an extent interrogate the concepts around humanity, history, and traumatic pasts. The climax shows the boundaries of collective identity redrawn from national and political ones to species ones. There is always going to be the idea of the other. It's an aspect of humanity from history that can be disputed, but in the beginning of the story, it was the Jewish population, then it was the Americans and the Soviets, now it's humans against mutants. History is presented indissolubly in the text because it is shaped by its chosen historical location.
I've been at the mercy of men just following orders. Never again.
Days of Future Past, set in 1973, is more relaxed in its historical engagement. The Vietnam War isn't held at the center of the story, but is still narratively present in the periphery and providing a backdrop. The draft effectively destroys Xavier's school, and the Paris Peace Accords is used as a set piece. And arguably the themes of Days of Future Past is about the agency in one's action within the context of hopeless fear and how succumbing to that anxiety will only lead to what you want to avoid. Which to an extent you could argue mirrors the cynical mood of the 1970s, I suppose? No, not really. The time period is presented too tonally jolly for that, so it mainly rehearses the past not necessarily to talk about it, but to service the cinematic ambitions of the story. Therefore, it engages with history, but to a much shorter extent. Then X-Men Apocalypse, set in 1983, which has no historical connection outside of a few visual choices and a deleted scene in a mall, and that's literally it. Apocalypse sends all the nukes that's on standby during the Cold War into outer space, so it literally won't affect the story. You could easily transplant the same script into modern day and it wouldn't affect anything. The story isn't about societal fear towards the inevitability of global destruction or the rise of consumer culture in a post-affluent American society, both topics of which could have easily been involved in providing Apocalypse more specific motivations and wanting society to deify him once more, but instead, the time period is literally an aesthetic. It's a fashionable choice. And now in Dark Phoenix, set in 1992, there's absolutely nothing that addresses its time period whatsoever. It doesn't have any significant or identifiable temporal markers, apart from, I think, like a 1-second appearance of George Bush Sr. as the president. Yeah, that's it. It's completely disengaged from its own chosen historical location. It's weird. There's literally nothing to say. Unless I missed something. Which could be possible because I was asleep during the movie. Presenting the past with no specific purpose is not a completely vacuous process, though. I mentioned this before in my old Bumblebee video, and I have to mention again here. The representation of nostalgia is commonly and academically divided into two typologies. Either it's reconstructive or deconstructive. Basically, it's either you reinstate an image of the past as a modern truth, or you challenge it. Many scholars have their own variations of this binary model. Immanuel Kant defined it as reproductive/recollective imagination versus productive/inventive imagination. The works of Svetlana Boym categorized it as restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia, and Andrea Hoyson modeled it as reconstruction and renegotiation. The X-Men movies broadly fit in reconstructive imperatives because they're not about realistic historical situations that challenges your preconceptions of the time periods, and they never claim to have authority over history in any way. X-Men by nature is about social inequality, of course, but these films aren't about the nuances of poverty or middle-class nepotism. They're about the big emotions, from saving the future from 9-foot-tall purple robots, a big screaming blue man, and shape-shifting aliens. They also depend on very unspecific public memories of the past. In other words, they're very stereotypical. 60s and 70s and 80s were hip and cool, right?
I'm just saying, Empire is still the best.
But the reconstruction versus deconstruction understanding only works well on a broad level. These typologies ignore the varying distinguishable levels of superficiality. You can reconstruct the past without conveying very specific historical values, because in the case of X-Men Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix, the historical context isn't even involved in storytelling. These movies have a pick-and-choose logic to them. In the mnemonic imagination, Emily Keightley and Michael Pickering defined this specific mode of superficiality as retrotyping. Effectively, it is the trivial commercial commodification of nostalgia, as it's about decorating a packaging rather than engaging in the content. Therefore, to an extent, nowadays, the space of historical thinking is heavily merged and associated into the acts of consumption, if we were to push this even further. But this explanation does suffer from a level of analytical one-sidedness, because not everything has to be about power, social decline, or Alphasurian ideas of society, because this assumes all art and cultural artifacts are insincere and even consciously conspiratorial in their decision-making. Part of me is quite smitten by how relaxed the X-Men movies are in their sense of continuity and historical commitment, because in a strange way they've accidentally crafted the floating timeline logic from comic books, where characters never visibly age despite visible changes in time, from fashion to technology to even the way characters speak. An example is in Brian Michael Bendis' and Michael Gaydos' Alias, where there's a flashback to Jessica Jones' origins set in a vague past that is illustrated in a Steve Ditko 1960s style artwork. In fact, a young Peter Parker ripped straight from Amazing Fantasy number 15 is even Jessica's schoolgirl crush. The writing never specifies that this is 1962, because otherwise everyone would be in their 50s and 60s now, but the historical aesthetics is instead used as a storytelling tool in contrasting the gritty modern tone from the rest of the comic. And that same abstract and aesthetical logic is present in these X-Men movies. Granted, they shoot themselves in the leg by giving specific dates, but superheroes are similar to a floating balloon. They're never truly tied down to their specific historical location, they just hover above the changing temporal horizon. Even though the thematic focal point of the X-Men originates from the social climate of the civil rights movement era of racial intolerance,
never forget, mutants and proud.
X-Men stories don't always have to be about that. They've evolved away from its original reference into this longitudinal soap opera decade-long mode of storytelling. Characters like Cyclops, Professor X, Wolverine, Magneto, Jean Grey, Storm, etc. are now these immortal elemental cultural figures, and in a way it illustrates the strange social change we're going through as a civilization. Modernity is characterized by a lack of solid footing in time, in the sense that everything around us is reproducible and always circulating in some form. Therefore, to an extent, material culture has mediated our relationship with time. We remember constructed representation of the past rather than through our environment, traditions, and even our lifestyles. Something as simple as the light bulb has desynced our everyday routines from the organic movement of time. A lot of academics consider this as the loss of historical consciousness, but it's kind of cool if you think about it, because we've become more mnemonically democratic, in control, and knowledgeable because of this mediation. Anyone can have their personal history circulate in the constant river of information now, but culture is also going through an epochal process, reconciling with how fast and yet long this period of intensive mediation has been. Even though the X-Men movies, minus First Class and Days of Future Past, to an extent aren't exactly the most imaginative in using the past as a creative resource, these movies, alongside the current memory boom of nostalgic representation, show flashes of a new practice in using the past as a new set of colors. new tools to be played around with for the enjoyment of imaginative and cinematic exercises, and also represent a convergence between mediums, similar to how long-form intertextual storytelling techniques from comics are being translated into the Marvel Studios films. Temporal aesthetical behaviors from comics are present in this weird era of Fox X-Men films. And all this shows that times are changing ever so subtly, even in our goofy entertainment. That is the worst and most terribly vague way to end this stupid video. I'm so sorry I wasted everyone's time. Jesus Christ.